Whispers of Hollow Creek. Chapter 1. Return to Hollow Creek. Emily Carter stepped off the rickety bus, the tires crunching over gravel, and felt the familiar chill of Hollow Creek's autumn air wrap around her like a damp, invisible cloak. Fog rolled in low, curling along the cracked streets and winding around the lampposts, curling like a living thing. Her breath formed little clouds in front of her face, and she pulled her jacket tighter, the cold somehow deeper than the season should allow. The town seemed smaller than she remembered, yet heavier, as if the years of whispered rumors, secrets, and unspoken fears had solidified into the very walls of its houses. Maple Street stretched ahead, a row of aging Victorian homes, their paint peeling, porches sagging under the weight of decades. The air smelled of damp leaves, wet earth, and old wood. Emily's heart beat faster. It was the smell of her childhood, but tainted now with unease. Her family home stood at the far end of the street, tall and narrow, ivy crawling like veins up its brick walls. She had left Hollow Creek 10 years ago, running from the shadows she could never explain. But now, forced back by tragedy, she could not escape them. Pushing open the front door, she felt it. The house seemed to breathe, the floorboards groaning underfoot. Dust motes floated in the weak sunlight filtering through the tall windows, and the familiar scent of aged wood and neglect filled her nose. A shiver ran down her spine, as if the house itself recognized her and remembered the long nights she had spent awake, feeling eyes watch from every dark corner. The reason for her return was grim. Lucas Bennett, her childhood friend, had drowned in the creek at the edge of town. The official report called it an accident, but Emily knew better. Lucas had always been sensitive to the town's hidden darkness. In recent months, he had become obsessed with the old mill, speaking of voices in the walls, shadows following him, and an unseen presence that watched whenever he entered the forest. That first night back, Emily unpacked quietly. The wind rattled the windows, though the house seemed perfectly sealed. Somewhere in the distance, carried faintly on the breeze, she thought she heard her name. Soft, almost imperceptible. Emily. Emily. She shook her head and told herself it was her imagination, but that night, as she lay in her childhood bedroom, the shadows seemed thicker, heavier, as if pressing down on her. Sleep did not come easily. Every creak, every sigh of the old house sounded amplified, like whispers meant only for her. Chapter 2. The Mill Beckons. The morning fog lingered stubbornly over Hollow Creek, threading through the streets and curling around the town like fingers. Emily walked slowly, her boots crunching over damp leaves, toward the library. She needed answers. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and varnish. Dust motes danced in the sunlight that managed to seep through the tall windows. Rows of shelves loomed over narrow aisles, stacked with the town's forgotten history. Looking for something in particular? The librarian, a stern woman with sharp gray eyes and a tight bun, appeared at Emily's side. "My friend, he drowned in the creek. I think it's connected to the mill." The woman's eyes flickered with a shadow of fear. She lowered her voice. "The mill? You shouldn't go poking around there. Some things, they don't stay buried." Emily's stomach tightened. "Do you know what happened there?"
The librarian shook her head. Not everything is written in books. Some stories are better left as whispers.
Emily left, feeling both frustrated and more determined. She walked toward the outskirts of town, where the mill waited, a hulking relic of a bygone era, standing like a guardian of secrets at the edge of the forest. Its windows were gaping holes, the wooden walls rotting and splintering. Moss and ivy clung stubbornly to the exterior. Even from a distance, it exuded a strange, oppressive presence. She approached cautiously, every step crunching on gravel and fallen leaves. The door, swollen from years of damp, groaned as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was unnaturally cold, thick, and almost alive. Every sound, the drip of water, the creak of beams, echoed like a warning. A wind, sudden and icy, swirled around her, whispering softly. Emily froze. Emily. Emily! Her heart raced. She shook her head and told herself it was the wind, but when a shadow moved across the wall, without any discernible source, she realized that the mill was far from abandoned. Returning home, Emily felt the sensation follow her. That night the house groaned and whispered, as if the shadows of the mill had followed her through the fog. She sat on her bed, clutching her journal, listening. Faint scratching came from the walls. Footsteps echoed in the hall, and then she heard it clearly. A soft, childlike voice calling her name from the corner of the room. Emily. Sleep did not come. She felt the presence of the mill pressing down on her, distant yet undeniable. Something was alive, waiting, and it knew she had returned.
Chapter 3. Secrets in the Shadows. Emily couldn't sleep that night. The house seemed alive with whispered voices, creaks and sighs that grew louder in the darkness. She pulled on her coat and went to the small kitchen for tea, hoping to calm her nerves. The wind rattled the windows, carrying a faint scent of wet earth and decay from the creek. She paused, straining to listen. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the fog that hugged the forest's edge, she thought she heard faint laughter, hollow, echoing, and childlike. The next morning, she decided to seek answers from someone who might know the truth. Mrs. Hargrove, an elderly neighbor, had always been kind and unusually perceptive. Emily found her on her porch, tending to a small patch of late-season marigolds. "Mrs. Hargrove," she began cautiously, "do you know anything about the mill? About Lucas?" The woman's hands trembled as she paused, her eyes narrowing against the pale sunlight. "They never left, Emily. The mill, it keeps them here. Every time someone disturbs it, the shadows wake." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "Who keeps who?"
"The ones the town tried to bind," Mrs. Hargrove replied. Her voice quavered. "Generations ago, the townsfolk performed rituals, dark ones. They thought they were protecting Hollow Creek, but they failed. Something came through, something old, something that wants—" She faltered, looking past Emily, as if the shadows themselves might be listening. Returning home, Emily found herself compelled to examine Lucas's belongings. Hidden beneath his bed, she discovered a worn leather journal, the cover scratched and dirty. She opened it carefully, the pages brittle. The voices, they are everywhere, following me, watching me. The mill. It hides something beneath its floorboards, something the town tried to bind. I can feel it watching me. I'm not sure I'll make it through the night. Another entry read, I think the shadows remember me. I see them in my dreams, whispering my name. They are patient, Emily, patient and hungry. I fear that leaving will not save me. I don't know who can. If you read this, beware the mill, beware the fog. It waits.
Emily's hands shook. Every memory of her childhood nights, doors opening, shadows flickering in corners, the oppressive feeling of unseen eyes, suddenly made sense. The town itself was alive with the consequences of failed rituals. That evening, she went back to the mill. The fog was thick, crawling over the forest floor, curling around the trees like fingers. The mill's skeletal structure loomed through it, darker and more sinister than ever. The air around it felt electric, charged with an unseen menace. She stepped inside. The shadows seemed to twitch and move along the walls, almost sentient. The faint whisper of her name floated through the air. Her heart pounded in her chest. Every instinct screamed to run, yet she moved forward, drawn by an irresistible pull. Beneath the floorboards, she felt it. A trap door, slightly ajar. A shiver ran down her spine. Emily knew she had found the entrance to the mill's hidden secrets. The descent into darkness, into history, into danger awaited her. Chapter 4. The Descent. The fog had thickened by the time Emily returned to the mill, rolling over the creek like a living thing, curling through the skeletal trees of the forest. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the chill biting through her jacket, but she pressed on. The air around the mill seemed heavier than before, almost pulsing, as if the structure itself were aware of her approach. The door groaned when she pushed it open, and a cold draft greeted her like a warning. Inside, the shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, pooling and slithering along the floor. Emily's flashlight flickered, the beam cutting weakly through the darkness, illuminating broken machinery and splintered wood. Her fingers traced the edge of the trap door beneath the floorboards. It felt sticky with age, as though centuries of dust and neglect had fused it to the ground. She took a deep breath, bracing herself, and lifted it. The air that escaped was colder than any winter wind, carrying a faint metallic scent, and something else. Something like decay and old fear. A narrow staircase descended into blackness. Every step creaked under her weight, each groan of the wood echoing like a warning from the shadows. The flashlight trembled in her hand, and for a moment she thought she saw a face staring at her from the darkness, pale, hollow-eyed, twisted in silent agony. When she blinked, it was gone. At the bottom, the air was thick, suffocating. The walls were covered in ancient symbols carved into the wood, glowing faintly as if lit by an unseen flame. They pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, their strange geometry twisting her mind with unease. And there it was, a massive mirror, tall and dust-covered, standing in the center of the chamber. Emily stepped closer. At first, she saw her own reflection, pale and tense, eyes wide with fear. Then it shifted. The mirror no longer reflected her face, but a multitude of distorted visages, Hollow Creek's ancestors, their mouths frozen in silent screams, their eyes empty and accusing. A whisper slithered from the shadows, curling around her like smoke. "We never left. You belong here." Emily felt an invisible pull tugging at her chest, her mind, her very soul. Her body stiffened, and for a terrifying moment she thought she would be drawn forward, swallowed by the mirror itself. Shadows writhed along the walls, reaching for her with elongated, twisted fingers. The air vibrated with the faintest hum of voices, chanting words she could not comprehend. Panic surged. Her childhood memories, doors opening on their own, shadows watching, the cold, unexplainable feeling of being followed, coalesced into one horrifying truth. The mill had never been abandoned. It had been waiting for her, as it had waited for Lucas, as it had waited for generations.
Emily's instincts screamed at her to flee, but she couldn't move. The mirror demanded her attention. She realized that the mill thrived on fear, feeding on curiosity, terror, and regret. The spirits bound beneath it were patient, infinitely patient, and they hungered. Summoning every ounce of courage, Emily grabbed a heavy metal rod lying among the debris. With a deep, trembling breath, she swung it with all her strength. The mirror shattered, glass spraying like frozen rain. The wails of the spirits erupted, a deafening, heart-wrenching chorus of rage, sorrow, and despair. The chamber trembled violently. Beams cracked, wood splintered, and dust choked the air. Emily scrambled toward the staircase, the floor quaking beneath her feet. Shadows lunged at her, fingers brushing her skin, but she didn't look back. She emerged through the trapdoor just as the mill convulsed violently, collapsing inward. Outside, the fog swallowed the ruins, leaving only silence and the distant murmur of the creek. Emily collapsed on the wet grass, coughing and trembling, her hands cut and bloody from shards of glass. Above her, the sky was still gray, the forest still silent, but she knew. Hollow Creek had not let her leave completely. The shadows were patient, and they were still waiting.
The night after the mill's collapse, Emily couldn't sleep. Every creak in her childhood home felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to stretch closer, and the faint whisper of her name floated through the hallways. She wrapped herself in a blanket, trying to convince herself it was over, that destroying the mirror had ended the nightmare. But deep down, she knew better. Hollow Creek didn't let anyone leave unscathed. The next evening, driven by a mix of dread and determination, Emily returned to the creek. The water ran black and sluggish, reflecting the pale light of the moon through the thick fog. It was here that she first saw the figure. A pale, thin man standing at the water's edge, staring at her with hollow eyes. "Emily," the voice rasped, as though carried from beneath the water itself. She froze, recognizing the figure instantly. It was Lucas? Or rather, what remained of him. His face was drawn, eyes dark and empty, his mouth twisted in a silent scream. "Lucas," Emily whispered, "what happened?" He didn't answer. Instead, the shadows behind him began to move, forming shapes, faces, hands, contorted bodies, all writhing and reaching for her. Emily stumbled backward, heart pounding, as the fog thickened, curling around her like a living snake's. Memories of her childhood, of doors opening by themselves, of unseen presences watching, flashed through her mind. The mill had haunted her for years, and now its influence had followed her home, following her to the creek. The voices grew louder, overlapping, forming a single, terrifying chorus. "You belong here. You belong here." Emily felt an invisible force pulling her forward, dragging her toward the creek. Panic surged. She remembered Lucas's journal, the warnings, the rituals. Somehow she had to resist.
She grabbed a large branch from the ground and held it before her like a weapon, shouting into the fog, "I won't belong to you!" The shadows recoiled slightly, hissing like wounded creatures. The figure of Lucas flickered and then dissolved into the mist. The fog itself seemed to waver, like a breath held too long.
Summoning every ounce of courage, Emily ran, stumbling through the wet underbrush, her hands tearing at branches and roots as the voices screamed and clawed at her mind. She reached the edge of the forest and looked back. The creek and the ruins of the mill had vanished into the fog, leaving nothing behind but the echo of whispers and the distant sound of running water. Emily collapsed on the damp grass, gasping for breath. Her heart pounded, her hands were scraped and bloodied, and the fog swirled lazily around her, indifferent. She had survived, but Hollow Creek was still alive. The shadows were patient, and she knew with a cold certainty that they would wait for the next curious soul, the next foolish wanderer who dared disturb the town's secrets.
The morning after the confrontation, Hollow Creek appeared deceptively calm. The sun struggled through the low-hanging fog, casting a pale, gray light over the streets. Birds chirped quietly, their calls sharp in the still air. To anyone else, the town looked ordinary, untouched. But Emily knew the truth. The mill was gone, collapsed, swallowed by the fog, erased almost as if it had never existed. The townsfolk moved about their daily routines, polite and distant, glancing briefly at Emily with eyes that seemed to carry unspoken knowledge. They didn't speak of the mill or the shadows. They never did. Hollow Creek had a long memory, and its silence was part of its power. Emily returned to her childhood home, exhausted and battered. Every sound, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside, reminded her of the night she had confronted the spirits. She unpacked Lucas's journal, reading his frantic entries one final time. The warnings, the fear, the obsession. It all felt like a distant, horrifying echo now, yet a part of her soul remained tethered to the town. Even as she packed her bags to leave Hollow Creek, she could feel it, a subtle pull, gentle and persistent, tugging at her consciousness. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, older. The town's shadows lingered in her mind, whispering softly, reminding her that while she had escaped the mill, Hollow Creek never truly let anyone go.
The journey out of town was quiet. The fog clung stubbornly to the edges of the road, curling over the trees like ghostly fingers. Emily's eyes scanned the horizon, half expecting the ruined mill to rise again, to reach for her through the mist. But nothing came, only silence. Weeks later, in the safety of the city, Emily tried to forget, but the memories would not release her. In her dreams, she wandered the streets of Hollow Creek, fog curling around her ankles, whispers brushing her ears. She saw Lucas's face in the shadows, pale and hollow, beckoning. She saw the twisted faces in the mirror, their eyes accusing, their mouths silent yet screaming. At night, when the wind howled through the city streets and fog crept into the alleys, she heard her name softly, insistently. Emily. She understood then that the town's darkness was patient, eternal. Hollow Creek had survived centuries, binding its secrets and feeding on the fears of those who dared uncover them. She had escaped its grasp, but only partially. The shadows would wait. They always waited.